Hey everyone, Switch Double here. In this what if scenario video, I'm going to talk about what if that United Kingdom did win the American Revolutionary War and what things could have been happened to America afterwards and how it will affect it the present day. Let's start. By the early 1600s, the British have been colonizing the Americas. But sometime in the early 1700s, most of the settlements had formed into 13 British colonies, which included Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and South Carolina. For quite some time, those colonies had been given some autonomous control of this particular region. And this was only base colonies, and these colonies was always along the American East Coast. But sometime in the early to mid to late 1700s, the British Parliament wanted to have more control of their own colonies. And since sending ships back and forward between the American colonies and England would take sometimes weeks and maybe a month or so, depending on the weather. And when the Parliament or in the British government started to add some more taxes and they want to have some more control of the colonies, which led to the American colonies to have some dislike of all. And they were having very much angry, especially when the British government informed the colonies that they want to have some taxes against tea, which led to this famous Boston Tea Party in Boston, when this British colonists dressed as Indians and threw the tea into the ocean. But all that eventually led unto when in 1776, when the American colonies declared themselves as independent state from the British rule. And that was one thing the British did not tolerate it. So they decided to send over their army or their military over to Americas to stop this nonsense of declaring themselves as independent state. Even if there was much of this control of the history, the America's colonies, they didn't have this big army or the big navy like this Royal Navy from England. But they did fought against this. And this was eventually led to start this American Revolutionary War, or also known as American War of Independence. Or as Apple call it, American Freedom War. Well, it's in a sense basically the same thing. But anyways, what if, since the America's colonies fought between 1775 and 1784, when they had been declared as independent, and when the British had recognized America's colonies as an independent state. But here is the thing that we know at least about actually it happened. But what if, like a big what if that the British actually did win this American Revolutionary War and all from the start? How would things changed for the British colonists, and how would it eventually lead for all this, how would it will eventually affect the future of the time of this? Well, just before almost 10 years before the Revolutionary War had happened, United Kingdom or England had been given control over Canada after in 1763, when France gave Canada to England through this Treaty of Paris. But now that the British Empire was controlling Canada and also the 13 colonies for until 1783, when they recognized the colonies as an independent state. But, like I said, what if the British did win the war? They would still have been controlling the Canada and now the 13 colonies. And how would that happen? Well, since that the British Empire had some help from Germans, volunteers, soldiers, like mercenaries, and even had help from local Native American tribes, was actually allied themselves with the British. So, seeing from this, as what if what happened to America's colonies? Well, there would have been the British would have sent more soldiers and to maintain order as for sure, and to make sure that these British colonies would stay been obeying the British laws, and even all those leaders, the founding fathers or war leaders among the patriarchs, or I mean the say how the British would have been captured every single one of the leaders of the American Revolution. They would have been executed for certain of it, including George Washington would have been executed for treason. To them, all of them would have been marked as traitors to the British crown. And without the leaders, the people would have given up any potential future uprising. If the British had this mighty power of the navy and an even greater army, they could easily be declared themselves as victors, and that also would have meant that every single uprising or even potential uprising would be declared as crushed. But I'm still sure it would be still some smaller groups of resistance even after the war's over, try to keep fighting for peace, or maybe try to keep fighting for as independence. But if the British had managed to defeat every single major leader like George Washington and other leaders, without them, the other smaller groups were eventually given up or just being defeated. So what would happen to Americans even after all this? Well, I'm guaranteed for sure that the British would have continued to had 100% control of this, the 13 colonies, and this very ideal of a dream of as to become an independent state would have been crushed, and the people have given up the dreams of even doing so. But how would it eventually have happened in the future for us? I mean, we know that in current our world, that the Americans, they did win the war, and it eventually became an independent state, and which led to United States of America. But here's the thing: if the British did win the Revolutionary War, and had executed all the major leaders like George Washington and other things, and none of those, and even despite might be small pockets of resistance still, perhaps in the aftermath, trying to keep fighting to win, to make sure that the people would still have hope to being as independent. But having the news of sort of major leaders like George Washington was no longer alive, the people would probably have given up hope. And, well, how would it affect it? And even though the Americans colonists, they even had some help from France with some soldiers that involved themselves. Well, listen to this. Since Canada was given over to the British Empire 10 years before the war even started, and how would it affect the France, even if they even lost the help to aided the help for the British colonies? Well, the British Empire may have been sent some, perhaps demanded that the French don't involve themselves anymore in such things or aid it anyway. Perhaps even they would do some, maybe demand like a resources, or maybe demand to give up some territories, or I don't know. but they might have been do something about the Americans' aids of the France. They would do something to tolerate against, to maybe not like a revenge, but they maybe demanded that France maybe pay British Empire with some sort of amount of money for what they tried been doing. But what about the Native American tribes that did aided the colonists? Well, those Native American tribes would have been punished, especially if they managed to capture the soldiers or the Indians that was fighting as warriors for the colonists. They would also be executed or perhaps put in prison or something. But those tribes, those main tribes, while they might have been given a severe punishment, maybe they had to be relocated somewhere else in Americas, or maybe also had to been feeling the British Empire's don't tolerate disobedience even from the local Native Americans or anything. But those American tribes may have been suddenly just simply as being punished. I assuming that the British Empire would burn down those tribes' homes, those who has allied with the colonists. But what about those Native American tribes that was aiding the British Empire? Well, they would not be punished. They in fact would be rewarded for much of their aid. They more likely to have been given more land over to the British and to those Native American tribes that aided the British. They more likely would have been given some more lands from the Empire for their aid. But how about the future that will held for all others? Well, if at the time that the British Empire had once again retaken control of their colonies, at the time though, no one didn't even know how big the country were at the time. And since majority of the rest of the country was under still unexplored, still maintained unknown Native American tribes, and with that the British had crushed the American colonists' Revolution War plans. How about the other future events that would eventually take place, like the American Civil War? Well, that's unlikely would even happen otherwise. And as the British Empire had once again taken control of their colonies, they may also been started to focus on expanding their empire in the Americas even further west. And who knows, maybe they wouldn't be encountered other Native Americans like the Cherokee, the Apache, the Navajo, and even though they may have some smaller major fights, conflicts with those Native American tribes, but what if they managed to somehow what if the British Empire could make a deal with the Navajo and the other American tribes further west, allow them to live in their native lands they have been living for generations. What if the British Empire were going to allow that those Native American tribes like the Navajo and Apache to retain their lands, allow them to live there and don't force them to move? Because the American government did later on in the 1800s did forced several Native American tribes to move from one place to another, and they were scattered and lived in reservations. So if the British Empire would eventually be expanding their territory further west to uncover the entire Americas, what if that happened? But here's another part of that. California at the time later on during the 1800s was actually under control of Spain. But if they were, assuming it is, since what if that Spain were allowed to maintain control of Mexico, California, while the rest of the United States would belong to the Spanish crown or this British Empire. But even though that Britain, England and Spain at one time were enemies, but later on they became friends. But assume from that, if it happened that the British Empire would expand their American colonies even further west, all the way to almost near the west coast, except for California, which will be under control of the empire, the Spain Empire. But what if that happened? And that what if that they did encounter the other Native Americans like the Apache, Navajo, and other Indian tribes, and even the British Empire were going to allow them to maintain to keep their lands for themselves, but they would have to be obeying under the rule of the empire. If that were sure, they still would have been likely to be in conflicts, because when the government of US decided to expand further west, they had a lot of skirmished conflicts with the Apache, the Navajo, but eventually they did win. So if the British Empire would do the same thing, expand towards west, that would have meant they would have certainly end up in a conflict with the other Native American tribes. But in order to destroy them, if they somehow could make a deal with the Native American tribes, allow them to maintain to live in their land as to live there. But based on the things that we know, that the white settlers, Europeans, they decimated the bison population in order to somehow weaken the plains, Great Plains Indians, they like Apache, the Navajo. But what if that it didn't happen? What if the British Empire didn't have the same idea? If they didn't decimated the buffalo or the bison population, in order to, what if that somehow the British could make a deal, a peace treaty with the other Native American tribes, allow them to maintain their land for themselves, but under still being follow some of the rules and laws of the British Empire? Well, that could be a possibility, but I'm still certain it will definitely would have been some conflicts between the Native American tribes in the West against the British Empire, which were when the US government, when they did. So it still would have been much the same thing there. But the dream of independent state from the colonies would have been crushed, and more unlikely it would not have been possible, knowing how strong the British Empire's navy and its army were. And at the time, the American colonists, they didn't even have this great navy. They didn't even have this strong navy and army as the England had. There were a lot of people in the colonists that was actually supporting the British Empire, but others was against them. So, assuming from that. But how about this? What if the British Empire would expand further west, and they will eventually realize that California was under control of the Spanish Empire already, allowing them to maintain California and Mexico, since they were only smaller parts, since they already since they had already the whole mainland of Americas already, and including Canada, which was a majority of the North American continent. And if that happened, they made more likely to allowing Spanish Empire to control California and Mexico for themselves. And still, there definitely would have been some smaller conflicts between the British Empire and the Native American tribes in the far west. But how about those other states that would eventually become part of United States in later? Since United States did bought Alaska from Russia in the middle of 19th century, if the British Empire taken to control of the entire mainland of North America minus California, would it eventually would they even buy Alaska from Russia? Possible, but at the same time, maybe they didn't even care if Alaska, that part of state belonged to Russia. Even so, I don't think that they might even maybe to maintain peace with Russia. Maybe they decide to let that land belong to Russia otherwise. The British Empire unlikely would even care if that Alaska state or the land belonged to the Russia, because I don't think that they want to be involved themselves in a war with the mighty Russian Empire at the time, because it would have been devastating, because that land has more territory. But if they were sending a message to Russian Empire in order to buying that landmass, the part of land from the Russian Empire, it's possible they could doing the same thing as the US government did. But even so, it's possible that perhaps the British Empire would buy Alaska state, well, the land, the part of land from Russia, as America did, US did from Russia in the late 19th century. What about Hawaii? Since Hawaii became the last known state to be part of the United States during the late 1950s. But before then, Hawaii was actually its own kingdom. So assuming that the British Empire didn't even care, perhaps they didn't want to bother to doing it because maybe perhaps the British Empire had the main control, the entire North American continent, and that perhaps the Hawaii could have remained as an independent kingdom of itself, or perhaps been even maybe conquered by some other people, like say maybe the Japanese Empire. Perhaps Japan conquered Hawaii, or they could have maintained as their own kingdom itself. Well, that is all I can think of for this video. If you have any thoughts or theories about yourself, let me know. This is Switch Diablo, over and out.